Chapter 13. And as always, we start off with an excerpt from Dr. Chen's notes. Of coral wood the flesh of man was made, but when woman was fashioned by the Creator and the Maker, her flesh was made of rushes. These were the materials that the Creator and the Modeler wanted to use in making them. But those that they had made, that they had created, did not think, did not speak with their Creator, their Modeler, and for this reason they were killed. They were deluged. A heavy resin fell from the sky. The one called Ksekotovach came and ground their eyes. Kamazotos came and cut off their heads. Kotzbamlam came and devoured their flesh. Tukumbalam came too, and broke and mangled their bones, and their nerves, and ground and crumbled their bones. This was to punish them, because they had not thought of their mother, nor their father. The heart of heaven called Huracan, and for this reason the face of the earth was darkened, and a black rain began to fall, by day and by night. And that is an excerpt from the Popol Vuh, sacred book of the Quiche Maya, Book 1. Now we cut to Sedona, Arizona, Monarch Outpost 55, Titanus, Cecilia. Rick drove from Flagstaff to Sedona on the widening road through Oak Creek Canyon, admiring, as he always did, the great beauty of the place. 40 years ago, he had been making this drive, and he still loved it. He thought about how he'd brought his children here when they were young, to play in the creek. One day he explained that the stone the canyon cut through had been laid down mostly in the Permian period, and they'd spent the rest of the day crawling on all fours through the horsetails, pretending to be dimetrodons, the top predators of the early Permian. He was a rock hound and a paleontologist at heart, but that didn't always pay so well, so he'd put his degree to work in the oil fields down around Sedona. He reached the field and pulled his truck around by the office, a prefab metal building. He climbed out and stood for a moment, watched the pump jacks bobbing up and down like giant metal versions of the drinking bird toy he'd had as a kid. The pump jacks, of course, were drinking oil, or as his youngest, Molly, liked to put it, sucking the earth's blood. The operation was mostly automated, but there were workers around, minding things. About half a mile away, he saw the government guys were unusually busy. They had commandeered some land a few years back, claiming some sort of biohazard. It didn't matter, they could pull the oil right out from under them, and they kept to themselves. Sawyer stuck his head out of the shed. "Hey, Rick," he nodded. "I was headed on the west to have a look at the new site," he said. "I thought I would check in here first. Did you get my text?" "I was in the canyon," he said. He pulled his phone out. "There it is." "I just sent it," Sawyer said. "It's your seismograph. It's gone loony." "Huh?" Rick said. The seismograph was something he'd built mostly for fun nearly 30 years ago. His son Evan had helped him update it a few years back, so it recorded digitally instead of on paper. Sawyer was right. The usually flat line was looking excited, as if recording a distant earthquake, and a pretty big one. Or else a little one right under the ground, where they were standing. As he watched, the waves continued to spike. Now he felt it in his feet. The shed was starting to rattle. "Do you think it's one of the rigs?" Sawyer asked. "I don't know," he said, "but I don't like it." He stepped outside, looking at the field with a far more critical gaze. The ground exploded, and something long and black stabbed out of it, arched over, and slammed back into the ground about 20 yards from the shack. Rick stepped back so fast he banged into the shed. "Holy mother!" Sawyer swore. They were sticking up everywhere, jamming into the ground, jointed, covered in bristle-like hairs. The earth jumped and just lifted up. Almost quietly, the pump jack slid into the hole it left. He was barely aware that he and Sawyer were only a few feet from the pit it had come up out of. His whole nervous system felt like it was shutting down, the thinking part of his mind overwhelmed by fear hundreds of millions of years old, encoded into the primitive brains of his chordate ancestors. When they were prey to things like this, its spider legs held up a bulbous body, a face of squirming tentacles under two merciless eyes, buried in something like a cuttlefish. David, Anna, Molly, he thought, picturing their faces. The goddamnest thing, Sawyer said. It was the last thing Rick ever heard. And now we cut to somewhere near Munich, Germany. Monarch Outpost 67, Titanus Methuselah. The cork came out of the bottle with a loud pop, sailing across the meadow. That's littering, Lara said smoothly out of the blanket, and placing their little picnic of cheese, bread, and strawberries on it. It's cork, Yannick said. Biodegradable. Uh-huh, she said, as he poured the champagne into 2 plastic cups. Paper is also biodegradable, but if you throw it on the ground, it's littering. He handed her a cup. Toast, he said. They both took a sip. Listen, Yannick said, I grew up right around here, you know. You see the mountain here? You're trying to change the subject from littering, she said, but she glanced behind her and saw the mountain he meant, rising over the trees. My grandfather told me it wasn't always there. There was a village instead, and then one day a guy who was traveling in from some other country came home. The village was gone, and that mountain was there. I see, Lars said. And when did this happen? Very long ago, he said. The Middle Ages, maybe. Your grandfather must be pretty old. My family has been here for centuries, he said. But let me tell you the other thing about the mountain. They say if you bring a pretty girl here and ask her to kiss you, she can't say no. Oh, I see, Lara said. Well, it's a good thing you haven't asked me. I would hate to prove your legend wrong. He grinned and leaned towards her. But I will prove it wrong, she said. He stopped and reddened a bit. Yannick was used to getting his way with girls. She knew. With his long blonde hair and blue eyes, he was almost pretty. He could be interesting if he wanted to, so maybe someday she wouldn't mind that kiss, maybe even later today. But not now. Are all university girls so hard to get? He asked. You tell me, she said. You've gotten plenty of them from what I've heard. What's so wrong with that? He asked. I like educated women. I like men who don't litter. Fine, he sighed. He stood up and wandered off in the direction the cork had flown. She had a strawberry and looked off into the distance. Aha, Yannick said. He held up the cork. And then his gaze went past her, his eyes widened. The mountain, he said. Oh, now I'm going to hear more about this magic mountain, am I, she said. Come on, you've tried that on me already. Be original. No, he said. The mountain, His scream was surprisingly high-pitched. It was so surprising, it set her skin on edge. He turned and ran. Really? He's taking this too far, she said. But then she felt the earth shift below her. She turned around and saw the mountain was standing up on 4 immense legs. It had a face and horns like a bull from some ancient hell, and as she watched, it put one ponderous limb forward and then another. The forest growing on its rocky back shriveled and shook with each step. She didn't scream. She kept her breath quiet. It was 1/2 kilometer away at least. It would never notice her unless she drew its attention. They had walked here after taking the train from Munich to the little town over the hill. She thought that was where it was going. When its head was out of sight, she picked up the champagne bottle and began drinking. And now we cut to the Indian Ocean. Classified Monarch Outpost, undesignated Titan. In his office beneath the Indian Ocean, Dr. Kingsley Nkande lay on his coat and watched the surface of the water some 10 meters above him. He had tried to take a nap. He hadn't slept in over 24 hours, but sleep eluded him. He was too troubled. He'd been meant to fly to Lagos to see his wife and little girl for a week, and now all of this. He knew Emma Russell. His dissertation had been based on some of her early work. He'd had great pleasure to meet her at a conference there. She had recruited him for Monarch. It was so hard to believe she'd gone mad. 2 Titans unleashed on the world, and the suspicion was that she would try to release more. Their floating containment was probably one of the safest. Very far from land, anything flying or moving under the water would be noticed from very far away. But that didn't stop him worrying, of course. Let the nap go, he was going back up. But instead, he went to see Kraken. That wasn't its official name, it still hadn't been assigned one in the Monarch classification. That was fitting, since this outpost was similarly unnamed. But someone he seemed to remember, it was Delvin, had called it Kraken. And that name had stuck. They had discovered the sleeping titan on a seamount in relatively shallow water, curled around the remains of a nuclear sub that had been missing for decades. They had built the containment around him, sub and all. He was in deep hibernation and didn't seem to have noticed a thing. The habitat part of the base, the living quarters, the control room, the laboratories, was all either on the surface or near it. But to observe the Titan directly, or take some sort of sample, several elevators ran through the ocean down to various points adjacent to the beast. They had learned quite a bit about Kraken. X-rays, sonic scans, DNA analysis had built a picture of what he must be like. His central brain cavity was enormous, far larger than it needed to be to control his body, suggesting a certain amount of intelligence, not unlike his distant cousins, the octopuses. Although, unlike octopuses and squids, his head was protected by a dense, curving cone of shell. He had dozens of smaller brains associated with his limbs, like octopuses. He could also change the color and pattern of his skin and shell. When they found him, he had been virtually invisible. They pinpointed his location by radiation signature and his biosonic emission. He had multiple hearts, and there was good evidence that he could regenerate limbs, and in fact virtually any part of his body. The elevator came to a stop. Ikande stepped out. One of the techs, Jane Harris, looked up from her instruments as he came in. Otherwise the lab was empty. The large window faced one of Kraken's eyes. It was closed and had been closed since they found him. Jin, the paleobiologist, thought he was in the middle of a sleep cycle that might last another decade, unless he was threatened. They had been quite careful not to make him feel threatened. "Anything new?" he asked. Harris shook her head. "No, nothing. Same as always. All functions are there, but at very low levels." "How about topside? Any more titans cut loose?" He shrugged. "Nothing new there either. I almost feel slighted. Why wouldn't our big fella be invited to the ball?" "Don't even say it," she replied. She frowned. "What?" She fiddled with her equipment. "Nothing, I guess. There was just a little spike, but it went right back down." "No, wait." The comm suddenly blinked on. He answered it. "Ikande here. Dr. Ikande, it's Jen. We just got a flood of reports. Titans have been released in at least 4 other locations simultaneously." "Released? By terrorists?" "It's unclear. Doctor, things are kind of chaotic at those sites." "Of course they are," he said. He looked back at Jane, who was now frowning in earnest. "What is it?" he demanded. "Is he waking up?" If he was, the containment field should still hold him, but there was no way to be certain of that. If he woke like the other Titans, it would be best to use the kill switch. Emma had clearly thought of something the rest of them hadn't. "No," Jane said. "The opposite. His hearts are shutting down, one by one." She looked over at him. "He's dying." "Why?" "I have no idea. It's like he's having an allergic reaction or something. Everything's dropping off, including radiation signature. He stared at Kraken's lidded eye, trying to decide how he felt. This creature had been put in his charge, and he had failed it. He knew how many of Monarch's scientists, like Sarazawa, felt about the creatures. On the other hand, if it died naturally, he wouldn't have to pull the kill switch. "Did you get all of that, Jen?" he asked. "I did," she replied. I don't understand." "Call it in," he said. "Tell Castle Bravo we'll be sending them our data. Maybe whatever happened to..." His words stopped in his throat. Kraken's eye was open, staring at him. "Oh God," he said. "Turn on the containment field." "Done," Jane said. "Doctor, I'm getting nothing. This says he's dead. His eye is open. Maybe some post-mortem reaction?" But then she broke off too. One of the tentacles was suddenly right there, pushing against the containment field. No, pushing through it, effortlessly. "What is happening?" Kalle yelled. "The field works on living titans," Jane said, getting up from her workstation, knocking a coffee cup off. It shattered on the floor. "Kraken still doesn't read as alive. His skin prickled, and suddenly he felt very cold, as understanding dawned. Oh shit. Protective coloration was only the surface of what this thing could do. It could mimic other states. It could make sonar, think it wasn't hearing anything, disguise its radiation signature, play dead. The tentacle was reaching for them, but it wasn't here yet. He bolted towards the kill switch, but the tube suddenly collapsed. Water rushed in with such force that it almost knocked him out. He saw the other tentacle had reached around the back, quietly wrapping around the elevator tube. He got his bearings and tried to swim towards the surface, but Kraken was way ahead of him, grabbing the floating base and dragging it down by the middle. Ikande kicked desperately until something took hold of his leg and yanked him back down. And now we cut to Tingua Preserve, Brazil, Monarch Outpost 58, Titanus Behemoth. Mariko crawled through the hatch and into the access tunnel. The alarms were blaring and everyone was running around like crazy. Behemoth was awake. He had been sleeping deep in a cave in the Tingua Preserve, not far from Rio de Janeiro. Mariko had been on the crew that discovered him. Her first job with Monarch. First job period. After the containment was set up, she had volunteered to stay on. It was actually a great gig. Behemoth was, to her, the most interesting of the Titans. And when free time came to her, Rio and its beaches were less than an hour away. Quicker if she could catch the helicopter ride. Her Portuguese had gotten pretty decent. She'd made friends. She was only 25. The future had looked bright. But now everything had changed. She reached her destination, a panel on the wall of the tunnel. She did her job quickly, then continued down the tunnel, opened another panel, and dropped down into the room beyond. Mounted high in the cave, the room was shaped like a hockey puck. The wall of the circumference was transparent, giving her a good view of the giant below. His legs were folded under him, his mighty tusks curving above him. As she watched, he struggled against the containment field, trying to stand up. "Mariko, why didn't you just use the door?" She turned around and found Eric staring at her, his bespectacled eyes full of puzzlement. "I was checking the wiring in the access tunnel," she said. "The meter downstairs showed some resistance. It looks okay up here, though." "You could have sent a tech," he said. "Yeah," she said, "but I wanted the view." "Are you crazy? He's trying to break out, like the others." "I know," Mariko said. "What are you up here for?" "Back up," he said. "Dr. Singh has us on standby to use the kill switch." Not all kill switches were the same. Each was tailored to its titan, and no one was sure if any of them would work. But Singh was pretty confident with their setup. Behemoth roared and pushed up hard, swinging his head through the containment field and shredding the equipment that powered it. The field vanished. Floodlights snapped on everywhere. Towards the front of the cave, dozens of security personnel took position. "Eric!" The voice came through the intercom built into the control panel that otherwise had a few indicators and a single switch, locked beneath a cover with a keypad entry. "Dr. Singh," Eric replied, "we've had negative results here. We're not sure why. Go ahead and enable the backup kill switch." "Will do, Doctor." He punched in a code and flipped up the cover. "Enable," he said. "Do it," Singh said. Eric reached out and flipped the switch. Nothing happened. He flipped it back, and then again. Nothing happened. He reported. He checked the instruments. "There's no power." "No," Mariko said. "There's not." Eric looked at her, eyes wide. He then glanced at the hatch to the access tunnel. "You were in there. You cut the line that triggered the cascade." She nodded. "Oh my God," he said. "Are you one of them?" "I'm Monarch," she said. She nodded towards Behemoth. "Look at him," she said. "You think we have the right to just kill a god? He was here long before we were. There are cave paintings of him in here that are 12,000 years old. That's just after people got here. The indigenous people still have a name for him. Mapingari. You heard Emma. We have to let him go." "You're as crazy as she is. How long have you been working with her?" "I'm not," she said. "At least not the way you mean." "You heard her speech. She's right. Our seas are dying. The rainforests are nearly gone. Thousands of species exterminated. I'm proud to help her." Behemoth rose to his full height, or at least his full height on 4 legs. There was a running bet around whether he could go bipedal or not. She was in the yes camp. His tusks are thick. Hair made him look superficially like a mammoth, but he was really built more like a giant ground sloth. His forelimbs were longer than his back, and he could rest on those knuckles of hands or paws with thick, sharp claws. The only way he could use those claws was to stand up with his stubbier hind limbs. She saw muzzle flashes from 4 small arms, but couldn't hear the gunshots. "You've killed us all," Eric said. "Probably," she said. Behemoth leaned back, and his forelimbs came up from the floor. His tusks dug into the ceiling, and the entire cave shook. He swatted the soldiers shooting at him with his claws. It looked almost funny from a distance, like he was knocking over toy soldiers. She felt sorry for them, for everyone who had to die, but this was how it had to be. "I was right," she said. "About what?" "Bipedal," she said. "God damn it!" Eric yelled. He climbed onto the crawlway. It didn't matter. There was no way he could fix it. Not in time. Blue-white flame jetted towards the Titan from somewhere near her. Behemoth screamed and turned around. He was facing her now. She could see his eyes, the eyes of a god, an angry god whose sanctity had been violated. The fire spewed at him again. This time she saw where it came from, a nozzle protruding from the ceiling. She hadn't known about that. Behemoth saw it too. He roared and lunged forward. "Come on," she whispered. "You know what to do." The ceiling of the cave was higher here. This time, then, he rose up. He was nearly at his full standing height. His face was meters from her when his tusks smashed into the ceiling. Huge chunks of stone tore loose, followed by a tremendous explosion as the reservoir of napalm or whatever was breached. Behemoth turned back towards the cave entrance, covered in flames. The fire seemed to find no purchase on his fur, and quickly burned out. He didn't look hurt at all. The cave, however, was filling with fire. The rock was still falling. The observation room shook, wobbled crazily, and tore loose from the ceiling. Mariko had one last sight of Behemoth, crashing through the barriers at the cave entrance. And now we cut to Jebel Barkal, Sudan, Monarch Outpost 75, Titanus, Kalle, Bembe. The ground twitched beneath Nez's feet. She almost didn't notice, but then she saw that nearby everyone in the control room was looking around, puzzled. Then the floor lurched, and the people began screaming. "Satellite!" Nez snapped. "I've got nothing," Connett said. She turned on her headset. "Squads," she said. "Everyone, shout out in order. What are you seeing out there?" None of the helicopters had seen anything, nor had anyone on the ground. The desert was quiet, nothing on radar either. "It's Eminem," Kalle said. "He's moving." "Hit the kill switch," she told Kearns. He shook his head. "Turn on the containment field." "I'm way ahead of you," Kalle told him. The floor kicked up hard, overturning tables, sending people and equipment flying. "What the hell is going on?" Kearns yelled. "Radiation levels are rising," Kalle said, "and I'm getting something on the biosonar monitor." "Kalle?" "Yes, his heartbeat is quickening, but there's something else, something more distant, sir. He's pushing against the field." Nez keyed on the radio. "I want all choppers back here now," she said. "Retcon units, you too. Be ready to fight." She looked up at Kearns. "He can't get through the field," the scientist said. "He can push all day. Mothra's field was sabotaged. Ours is intact." "Sir, that's bullshit," Nez said. "He's breaking free. You know what you have to do. If you don't, I will." "Sergeant," Lang said, "these creatures." "Jesus," Kalle swore. The lights dimmed. "What?" Kearns snapped. "The containment field just overloaded. Evacuate the base," Nez said. "Now." Then she pushed him aside and ran towards the kill switch. Only yards away, before she got there, the entire building abruptly flipped on its side. She flailed through space and hit the walls so hard it knocked half a ghost out of her. Nez came to, with the taste of blood in her mouth, a god-awful stench in her nostrils, and a sound like a rock slide that just went on and on. Bodies littered what used to be the wall of the building. The whole place was shaking. The power was out, but lights poured in through the splits in the metal of the prefab. As she rose to her feet, the whole building dropped and tilted again, more slowly this time, until it was upright again. She was 2 meters from the door. It burst open, and sand and gravel began to pour in through the bottom third. They were sinking. "Everybody out now," she yelled. Kearns was clearly dead, as were several others. Kellers and Ishmael were alive, but dazed. "Out, I said!" Ishmael nodded rapidly, scrambling up of the mound of dirt and through the door. She managed to get Keller on his feet and dragged him through. Outside, once level ground, was now a slope. The 3 of them scrambled up it as the building behind dropped another few meters, burying the door. She turned and stared. It was like watching him being born. He emerged from beneath one of the pyramids. Control had been almost on top of his containment and was now falling into a hole. Kalle and Bembe was leaving behind. Most of the compound was still intact. Monarch personnel were pouring from the building, screaming to high heaven, flailing their arms, tripping over one another. His back broke out first, gray, pebbled like some lizards she had seen. Enormous 5-clawed forelimbs pulled at the edge of the pit, and then his long, curved horn knifed out of the sand, followed quickly by his head. It looked something like an earless elephant, except that his tusks turned down rather than up. His tail had unwound. It made up 2/3 of his body length. His trunk flickered out like a snake striking straight at them. She yanked out her sidearm, but she was already too late. It snatched Kalle, pulled him back. The long elephantine head opened like a crocodile, revealing thousands of teeth. Then Kalle was gone. "Run," she told Ishmael. An osprey shrieked by overhead, and then another, jamming with their 50 caliber guns, launching rockets. She looked back in time to see a missile explode against Kalle and Bembe. It didn't seem to bother him much. That trunk was fast, whipping around, snatching up people, 3 and 4 at a time. It was completely out of the pit now, lurching forward on 4 thick legs. The front legs were a little taller than the rear. Its tail sliced through a pyramid and then flickered up to cut an offspray in half. It was as if the world was new again, she thought. The monsters had ruled in the beginning, and now they returned to rule again. And now we go to Skull Island, Monarch Outpost 33, Titanus Kong. Alone, quiet, he sat on the mountain ridge and looked over his territory. The gleaming waters that held the sun in their waves, the shore where land and sea met, the grassland and the jungle, all quiet. The heat of the sun warmed his fur. The last of his wounds was now merely just an itch along his ribs. In time he climbed down from the ridge. He walked his old paths to the place where the world of both night and day crossed, the paths of always night. The hollows in the stone where his enemies lived. That was quiet too. The smell of the enemies was faint and old. His feet felt nothing in the stone. He went from valley to valley searching. He went by the little things that spoke to him in voices like wind, but they had nothing to say. He returned to the ridge and watched the colors in the sky, watched the sun burn behind the clouds, dim, vanish. He watched the smaller sun appear above. A breeze came from the distant place, a place he did not know, with strange scents on it. He heard the call. He heard calls before, not the enemies who killed his parents, the deep dwellers, others, somehow more like him. When he was young, he did not hear them often, but in recent seasons, the calls were more frequent. Once, he had heard one of the others, near, very near the island, but it wanted nothing of him, so he did not care. But this other wanted something, wanted him to come, to hunt together, and he heard responses, many of them. For a long time, each season was much like the next. The rains came and went, the animals of the island were born and died, and he went on as always. But something had changed now. It made him restless. It made him a little angry. Change was not good. Let them stay away from him, these others. He did not care about their places, their islands. Best they did not come for his. He felt movement in the stone beneath him, and his anger grew brighter. The deep dwellers heard the call too, the crawlers with faces like bone that haunted his sleep. They were waking. The quiet was over. He scratched the itch on his ribs and began to hunt.